In May of 2018, Parabon Nanolabs reached out to Detective Ransom, advising him of their new forensic genealogy services. After a free preliminary review of the case, Parabon notified the Boise PD that even though the initial matches pointed to a massive family tree and a Puerto Rican suspect, the case was highly workable, and they had located a possible second cousin of the suspect. Detective Ransom, who had long since been reassigned to his regular caseload and wasn't working Joyce's case full-time any longer, began the process of obtaining authorization for funding to pay for Parabon's services. Detective Vucinich retired shortly after this time, with Joyce's killer still eluding police. He told me that he was confident his colleagues at the BPD would stay with the case until it was solved. Parabon issued 2 reports in total to the BPD. The first initial genealogy assessment named the DNA matches in GEDmatch and defined their likely relationship to the suspect. Their second report in November of 2018 came up with 3 additional names Parabon recommended be contacted for family tree information and/or reference samples. In March of 2019, Detective Ransom began to research people on the family tree laid out in Parabon's report. He learned very quickly how difficult it was to determine who these people were and how they could be contacted. He first spoke with a woman named Isabel, who was the mother of a man in the family tree. She said she had very limited relationship with the man's father and knew nothing about the family. Next, he contacted the second wife of the top match listed in Parabon's report. She had started a public family tree on Ancestry.com and agreed to provide familial information to the investigator. However, she had no information about anybody in the Boise area. Through police in Columbia, South Carolina, Detective Ransom spoke with a woman who was listed in Parabon's preliminary family tree. After taking some time to think and pray on the idea of speaking with the detectives, she agreed to talk to them in May of 2019. She said that her mother had had 8 children, and she named them all for the detective, and one of them was not a name in the genetic genealogy report. This woman also verified some other names the detective provided her as possibly being stepsisters of her mother. However, most people in her family were deceased, and she didn't have any information about anyone in Boise. She agreed to provide a DNA sample to assist in narrowing down the family tree, and it was sent to Akesogen for testing and then to Parabon. The testing results indicated that this woman was not related to the suspect as closely as initially suspected. Her branch of the massive family tree could be ruled out. In July of 2019, Detective Ransom was promoted and taken off the case. In late 2019, Detective Paul Jagosh was assigned the Casper case. He reviewed the 2 Parabon reports. Then he happened to attend a class led by Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick of Identifinders International, who had done the Y-DNA work a year earlier. Dr. Fitzpatrick agreed to assist the BPD with the case and reviewed the DNA data. She assigned one of her genealogists who had experience in Hispanic genealogy analyses. Remember that the team knew from the suspect's genetic admixture information that he was likely of Puerto Rican descent. Luckily for the genealogists, Puerto Rico utilizes U.S. government birth, marriage, and death records, and census information, as it is a U.S. territory. But on the other hand, Puerto Rico is an island and typically experiences extensive endogamy within its population. Further, its records, although thorough and inclusive of multi-generational names, are in Spanish. Identifinders uploaded the suspect's SNP profile to GEDmatch. They later also uploaded to Family Tree DNA, but found no significant matches there. The top 2 matches were first cousins to each other. They shared 258 centimorgans, somebody named R.E., and 208 centimorgans, A.A., with the suspect, respectively. This is equivalent to a half first cousin once removed, a half great aunt or uncle, and so on, not a super close relationship. Also, since the top 2 matches were related to each other, they represented only one side of the suspect's family tree. On August 19, 2020, the Identifinders genealogist reported that she may have identified the most recent common ancestors of the top 2 matches. Based on documentary evidence, these were possible great-grandparents of the suspect. They were Ramon Echeverria and Ricarda Perez of Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, Ramon and Ricarda had a lot of children, 11. Detective Jagosh, who was also working active investigations at the time, simply could not run down all these family members and their own children. While all of this was going on, Identifinders genealogist Lisa Lewis took over the case in September of 2021. After a serendipitous meeting with some Puerto Rican natives on her vacation, Lisa was put in contact with a family records researcher in Puerto Rico to help her track down family members from this very large family from one specific region of that island. Many descendants from Ramon and Ricarda had moved to the United States, and tracking them all down with name changes, marriages, births, and deaths promised to be a very time-consuming task. However, Lisa had a place to start. She focused on two young girls listed in the 1920 census, Hilda and Ramona, whom the census reflected lived in the household of Ramon and Ricarda. Both girls bore Ramon's surname of Echeverria, but appeared to have predated his marriage to Ricarda, because they did not also have Ricarda's surname. Inheriting both is a Spanish custom. This meant that the two were Ramon's children and were half-sisters to the biological children born to that Echeverria Perez couple. But in the 1930 census, these two girls were no longer living in the household. It turned out they were separated and sent to live with other local families. By the 1940 census, they were both married and documented, so the genealogist knew she had the right women, the daughters of Ramon Echeverria, who could also be grandmothers to the suspect. I have to explain here that Lisa Lewis was driven by convictions she cannot explain that she needed to pursue the Hilda-Ramona angle. Some of genealogy analysis is intuitive, and that certainly seems to be the case here. She decided to trace Hilda and Ramona's descendants to see if the suspect could be a grandson of one of them. The problem was they were hard to find. There was no record of Ramona ever leaving Puerto Rico, but by 1940, Hilda had married a man named Francisco Rodriguez in New York. New York, one of the most common destinations for Puerto Rican natives relocating to the U.S. But Hilda and Francisco had not landed in the Puerto Rican community in New York City. They had moved to Lyons in upstate New York, where there were virtually no other people of Puerto Rican heritage, and so they were traceable, as were their 10 children born over an 18-year span. The genealogist couldn't access New York birth records, but could locate school registrations and other information documenting the Rodriguez family. The family was fractured and geographically diverse, with some offspring moving to Connecticut and New York, where the names were common. So the younger generation was much harder to get a handle on, and whether they had any kids themselves had to be researched as well. But Lisa was intrigued because the last name Rodriguez had appeared in some lower-level matches to the suspect DNA in Joyce's case. Of course, Rodriguez is one of the most common Spanish surnames. But the link of Hilda having married a Rodriguez was enough that Lisa felt she might be on the right track with Hilda's branch of the Echeverria family. And the shared DNA levels between the suspect and the top matches AA and RE were consistent with the suspect being one of the grandchildren of Hilda and Francisco. They needed to start contacting family members and possibly reference testing to ensure they were focused on the correct branch. But they were very hesitant to contact people in the tree because they were possibly working with close relatives. They didn't want anyone to be tipped off that they were closing in. Detective Jagosh told me that this was one of the challenges of this case, not knowing who was safe to contact among large groups of first-degree relatives. The detective conducted some background checks into people whose names were in the massive family tree to see if they could prioritize any family members through criminal records. And knowing that many names of the descendants of Hilda and Francisco were located in New York, Detective Jagosh contacted NYPD cold case detective Robert Decker. Detective Decker helped in tracking down names, addresses, and information for potential family tree members and provided these names and their information to identifinders. A lot of this was just collecting data points that individually were not that helpful, but taken as a whole might lead to the relevant descendant of Hilda and Francisco. For example, Detective Jagosh spoke with a Puerto Rican woman who lived in New York and documented the names of her father, born in Puerto Rico, and her mother, born out of wedlock in Puerto Rico. Another woman the detective contacted was born in Moca, Puerto Rico. Her daughter lived in Hollywood, Florida. He documented the names of her parents and siblings. Another woman was of Puerto Rican heritage, but all of her children lived in New York. She told the detective that she had done considerable research on her family tree and was willing to cooperate with the investigation. He put her in touch with the genealogist. Finally, another member of the family tree who lived in Stone Mountain, Georgia, was contacted for information. You're seeing the pattern here, right? Not one family member was known to have lived anywhere other than the East Coast, except for one family member who lived in Arizona. They had zero connections whatsoever to Boise, Idaho. I'm going to pause here and talk about an alternative suspect who diverted Detective Jagosh's attention for a short time. Detective Jagosh had learned from Parabon's initial reports on the genealogy, before the case was taken up by identifinders, about the most recent common ancestor couple Ramon and Ricarda Echevarria. He took a look at criminal records in Boise in the 1980s involving that last name, and he found a potential suspect. D.A. Echevarria was arrested in Boise in 1995 at age 31 on a probation violation and again later the same year for burglary. A protection order was entered against this same man in January of 1996, and he had another probation violation in February of 96. Then he was arrested in June of 1998 for preparing fraudulent documents and contempt of court. Looking into D.A. Echevarria's current whereabouts, Detective Jagosh learned that he was currently serving time in the federal prison in Oregon on drug charges. So the detective contacted Echevarria's daughter. She said when she was in first grade, she saw her father rape her mother. She gave the detective the name of her mother, and the mother told Detective Jagosh over the phone that she left Echevarria in 1998 because he used drugs and was violent. On multiple occasions, he choked her and told her he would kill her. Once she had passed out from being choked by him. He had also pointed a gun at her numerous times. She said he had raped her hundreds of times, forcing her to have sex with him against her will. Quote from Jagosh's report, I asked her why she didn't file any reports, and she advised that she did not know it was against the law to rape a spouse, end quote. The ex-wife said that domestic violence ran in Echevarria's family. So D.A. Echevarria looked like a good suspect on paper. He was a violent rapist and criminal who was in Boise in the late 1980s. His name was the same as a name possibly related to the suspect, although there was no clear connection between him and the Hilda Echevarria Francisco Rodriguez family tree. However, in looking into D.A. Echevarria, Lisa Lewis learned that he was only 50% Hispanic, with one parent hailing directly from Spain. The other 50% was Irish. Echevarria had green eyes. He did not match the suspect's brown-eyed, black-haired, 100% Puerto Rican pedigree. And it turned out his DNA had been entered into CODIS in May of 2015 and had never matched to the STR DNA profile of Joyce's killer. The Echevarria connection was not a connection at all, but a mere coincidence. Okay, back to the genealogy. On January 18, 2022, Lisa Lewis was finally able to locate one of Hilda and Francisco's confirmed children. Luis Angel Rodriguez had died in 2006, but his documented paper trail confirmed that he was definitely the son of Hilda and Francisco, both hailing from Puerto Rico and buried in Lyons, New York. Luis had one living son, Angelo Rodriguez, Hilda and Francisco's grandson. Angelo lived in Lynn, Massachusetts. Lisa knew he was too young to have killed Joyce and had no ties to Idaho, so she suggested that Detective Jagosh contact him for family tree information and to obtain a reference sample from him in order to confirm that they were on the right track, tree branch-wise. As soon as she sent the email, she found out from a family member's Facebook post that 50-year-old Angelo had died the day before, on January 16, 2022, of an overdose. Massachusetts required a release from a family member in order to provide a DNA sample from the deceased man, but Angelo had no surviving adult kin who were legally authorized to consent on his behalf to DNA collection. He wasn't married, his children were minors, and his parents and the one sister he had kept in contact with were all dead. So Detective Jagosh swore out an affidavit for a warrant to obtain a blood card from the Massachusetts authorities, had it signed by Ada County Magistrate Judge Michael Dean, and mailed those to a Detective Tim Ferrari in Massachusetts. This from Detective Jagosh's report, quote, the Massachusetts judge denied the warrant card for the DNA of the dead man, nor would they accept a subpoena directly to the medical examiner's office, end quote. They were out of luck getting a blood card for Angelo, even though an autopsy had been conducted, because the Massachusetts judge refused to honor the Idaho warrant. Requests for further investigation by the Massachusetts State Police went unheeded. Again, from Jagosh's report, quote, I have had little response or assistance from Massachusetts agencies in this case, end quote. I'm ashamed to say Massachusetts is where I live. Another disappointing performance from the Massachusetts State Police. Detective Jagosh and Lisa Lewis moved on. Then Detective Jagosh got a break. On May 25, 2022, he received a report from the Texas Department of Public Safety, identifying fingerprints submitted in Joyce's case. Someone had applied for expedited screening at the airport, TSA or CLEAR, and his prints had been collected and entered into the system. Boise PD Crime Lab Specialist Christina Sanchez notified Detective Jagosh that the prints that DPS got a hit on were the ones that had been lifted from Joyce's vehicle's rearview mirror all the way back in 1987. Detectives at the time felt it was possible the suspect had moved the mirror because it was a little bit askew, and now they had a hit on someone who had touched it. Again, I'm not reporting this guy's name, I'll call him Mike. Mike was a white male who would have been around 16 years old at the time of Joyce's murder. He still lived in Boise, but he had no criminal history whatsoever. His name did not appear to be anywhere in the case file. And Lisa Lewis was certain that Mike was not their guy since he didn't match the genetic phenotype information. Nonetheless, Detective Jagosh wanted to know why Mike's prints were on Joyce's mirror. Detective Jagosh called and set up an interview with Mike. He came into the BPD station, and Detectives Jagosh and Canfield told him they had found his prints on a murder victim's vehicle. They showed him pictures of the car. He didn't recognize it and said no, he didn't work on cars or recall moving any cars that weren't his in 1987. It was a mystery. And then Detective Jagosh asked him if he knew the name Joyce Casper. Mike said his grandfather had lived next door to somebody named Casper who had been killed. This rang a bell. He knew Joyce because she was at his grandfather's house quite often. Well, did you ever drive her car? The detectives asked. Mike said now that he thought about it, he had helped her clean up her house, picked up groceries, mowed the lawn, and so on, and he may have washed her car. He was around 16 or 17 at the time, he said. Quote, he had no idea how his prints got into the car other than he may have cleaned it, end quote. Mike agreed to take a lie detector test and give a DNA sample. The detectives held on to the sample, but they never tested it. Mike didn't fit the profile and seemed to have a good explanation for the prints. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Back to the genealogy. Lisa Lewis continued to try to locate the children of Francisco and Hilda. She used Been Verified, Facebook, and other social media to try to find connections. Most of the kids were not connected in any way to their siblings. One of the sons of Hilda and Francisco, Francisco Jr., had died the week before Lisa located him. So she suggested looking at daughters of Hilda and Francisco whose children could not be the suspect. 2 of their daughters had married men of another race, Caucasian, so their sons could not be the killer based on his admixture. In February of 2022, Lisa Lewis provided Detective Jagosh with the names of 2 adult women believed to be daughters of Hilda and Francisco. Detective Jagosh's report says, quote, there is still a risk in that they may know and alert the suspect. However, I am at a point in this case where the risk is worth the reward. Detective Jagosh contacted Detective John Kiesel of the Ontario, New York Sheriff's Office, who agreed to assist in attempting to obtain voluntary reference DNA swabs. Detective Kiesel approached the first reference tester, Hilda and Francisco's daughter, whom I'm calling Felicity. She confirmed that Hilda and Francisco were her parents, but she was not all that helpful because she didn't stay in touch with her siblings at all, and she didn't even recognize some of their names in the family tree Detective Jagosh showed her. Her adult son had a significant criminal record, but the genealogist knew that due to his half-Caucasian heritage, he couldn't be the suspect. Both Felicity and her son declined to provide reference samples. But Felicity did tell them something interesting. She said she did know a little bit about one of her brothers, someone I am calling R.A. Rodriguez Sr. She said, my brother R.A., he is very bad news. He has at least 10 children with different mothers from all different places. Detective Kiesel was able to track down the other sister who lived in Phoenix, Arizona with her son. I'll call her Nina. Nina didn't know who had killed Joyce, but also told Detective Kiesel that her brother, R.A. Rodriguez Sr., was not a good guy, and that he had had 7 to 10 children from various women in multiple different states. Detective Jagosh confirmed that R.A. Rodriguez Sr. had a rape charge in 1962 in Lyons, New York. He was still alive and working as a janitor. They needed to talk to someone close to R.A. Rodriguez Sr. Lisa recommended that the detective contact his son, R.A. Rodriguez Jr. Now, from a genetic standpoint, it was totally possible that R.A. Rodriguez Jr., grandson of Hilda and Francisco, was the suspect. But after looking into him and his background, Lisa really didn't think so. R.A. Rodriguez Jr. was a very successful MIT graduate and entrepreneur, someone who was esteemed and considered a pillar of the Boston community where he had lived until very recently. He had 0 connections to Idaho. Detective Jagosh contacted Marco Island, Florida police and asked a Sergeant Huffer to contact R.A. Rodriguez Jr. at his home there. On January 5, 2023, Sergeant Huffer contacted R.A. Jr., who agreed to speak with the investigators. He was incredibly helpful, and he provided the link they'd been missing. Detective Jagosh explained to R.A. Rodriguez Jr. he was investigating an old case and hoping to learn about his family tree. He asked about his brothers and sisters, and R.A. Jr. reeled off the list of names that he knew. But he also mentioned that he had a half-brother he'd never met. His father, R.A. Rodriguez Sr., had gotten a woman pregnant. She left the East Coast with the baby and moved to Boise, Idaho, with a preacher she had married. The baby, a son, was Ralph's half-brother. He had lived in Boise in the 1980s. The half-brother's name was Frank Rodriguez, and he was dead. R.A. Rodriguez Jr. declined to give a DNA sample, but now the detective and the genealogist had a family connection to Boise to investigate. Lisa Lewis had a list of R.A. Rodriguez Sr.'s kids, but she did not have his son Frank's name, because R.A. Rodriguez Sr. had never married Frank's mother. So Frank was not a documented birth son of R.A. Rodriguez Sr., and there was no way Lisa could have found him through genealogy research. Detective Jagosh dug into everything he could find about Frank Rodriguez. His report says, quote, I looked up Frank Rodriguez and found out he lived in Caldwell, Idaho up until 2007 when he died. I spoke with Caldwell police and the Canyon County Coroner's Office, who confirmed there was no evidence or samples left from his case, end quote. Well, you heard that. No DNA was available from Frank Rodriguez. They were going to have to get the next best thing. They could see from his obituary that he had left behind a wife, whom I'm calling Linda, and 2 sons. In early 2023, Detective Jagosh and Detective Roth drove to the Caldwell address listed for Linda and one of her and Frank's sons. The house was empty and had a for sale sign in front of it. The realtor told the detectives that the house had hit the market in May of 2022 when Linda moved to California with her son, who was disabled. Orange County, California Detective Sergeant Ackerman assigned detectives to track down Linda, and he finally spoke with her on March 15, 2023. Quote, I advised her I would like to speak with her about an old case. I assured her that neither she nor her son were in trouble or the suspect in my investigation. They both agreed to speak with me, end quote. On March 19, 2023, Detective Jagosh and Orange County Detective Wersching met with Linda. They sat down at the kitchen table. Linda verified to the detective that the son, whom I'm not naming, was definitely the biological son of her husband, Frank Rodriguez. Quote, I explained to the son briefly what we were looking at with the family tree genealogy line. I explained to him that someone in his family tree had committed a murder, and we needed his help with the DNA sample. I explained to him we had a test kit that we could do for him that would help with this case. The son agreed and submitted and signed the family tree DNA release form. They got their sample from son number 1. Then it was time to find son number 2, who was also living in California. A Detective McCoy tracked down the other son, locating a phone number for him, which he passed along to Detective Jagosh. When Detective Jagosh called him, he learned that the son was living out of his car in Torrance, but he agreed to meet with the detective at Starbucks on March 23rd at 10 a.m. There, Detective Jagosh and Detective Wersching told son number 2 that he wasn't in any trouble. They were here about his father. The son told them that his father, Frank, was a very angry person who would stay in his room and read the Bible and then would come out in an explosive rage. He never knew what would set him off, and he often became violent. Son number 2 agreed to give a DNA sample, and they swabbed him right there, which must have been quite a sight for all the bougie soy mocha latte sippers at the Starbucks. Detective Jagosh later explained, quote, we're in a Starbucks. I've got an N95 mask on, blue rubber gloves, a giant Q-tip, and I'm getting a mouth swab. Both sons' buccal swabs were sent to Family Tree DNA on March 23rd. The results came back on April 5th. The Family Tree DNA testing proved that both sons of Frank Rodriguez shared a level of DNA consistent with a parent-child relationship with the DNA from the suspect in the Joyce Casper case. Confirmatory testing at the Idaho State Police Lab verified the identification. The killer of Joyce Casper was Frank Rodriguez. On July 9th, Boise PD hosted a case debriefing for the Casper family, retired detectives, and media. Several members of the police force who had been impacted by Joyce's case addressed the assembled crowd of family members, media, law enforcement, and community members. The announcement was made that at long last, Boise PD had named Frank A. Rodriguez as the man responsible for killing Joyce Casper 36 years earlier. Detective Jagosh talked about how by the time genealogy solved this case, over 145 suspects had been investigated and cleared. He spoke about how complex the genealogy investigation was and all the hurdles the investigators had surmounted in getting to where they stood today. Quote, "Justice has been a long time coming, and we are proud and grateful to finally be able to give the Casper family some answers," he said. Lance Anderson, the first lead detective on the case whom I mentioned earlier, told the crowd that the case had never left his mind. As reported by KTVB7, Boise PD Captain Matt Jones told the crowd that back in 1987, his father, Detective Larry Jones, got the call to work the homicide. He said, quote, "My sisters and I were riding in a car with my father. I remember he received a message on his pager, and he had to stop to find a payphone. So often happens in a police family, we put our personal plans for the day on hold so Dad could go to work. Little did we know the work that began that day would last for 36 years. To the Casper family, to my father, and to all the retired members of BPD whose shoulders we now stand on, we solved it. Members of BPD's Criminal Investigation Division have spent years working to identify the person responsible for the death of Joyce Casper and close this investigation once and for all for Joyce's family. Justice has been a long time coming, and we are proud and grateful to finally be able to give them some answers." BPD Chief Ron Weinegar handed out certificates of commendation to each member of the BPD or the crime lab who worked the case. He said, quote, "We have an obligation to the person who is deceased to find out when, why, how, who. That's what detectives do. That's what lab personnel do. That's what investigators of every shape and size and department do, because it's important. I am grateful to those who worked so hard to bring this case to closure and who continue to work to bring justice and knowledge and information to family members of those who have been killed." KTVB7, the Idaho Statesman, and CBS2 Boise conducted extensive interviews with Joyce's adult children after the briefing. Roberta Casper Watson, Pauline Casper, and Chuck Casper had all returned to Idaho for the reception. Roberta told the publications that her mother was a friendly, generous, and vivacious force who was revered by her friends. Her high school classmates had frequented the soda fountain and lunch counter at her parents' drugstore, and her mom would fuss over them, listen to their stories, and give them makeup tips and hair tips. Roberta said, "My high school classmates were as upset with her death as I was." The siblings shared their feelings about the case remaining unsolved for so many years. They had all given up on ever getting answers. This from KTVB. When she first learned BPD solved her mother's case, Roberta said she didn't feel any semblance of closure, but that's since changed. "I feel less unsettled about it now, and for a long time I kind of felt unsettled about it. I put a lot of energy into trying to accept that we just would never know and that there was nothing we could do about it." Pauline said seeing the suspect's driver's license photo made a huge difference for her. "I didn't have to carry around some monstrous picture in my mind anymore. It's like, oh, that's what he looks like. That's the one who did it. So, yeah, it did bring closure for me," she said. Pauline told the Idaho Statesman, "It's hard to put into words to put a face to this person that did this horrendous thing to your mother. But when we saw a picture of him, he just seemed like a guy. Some guy you might see walking down the street. It was really disorienting in a way. It sounds like he didn't exactly go on to a happily ever after life, so I suppose there's more than one way to get punishment. Every chapter in your life needs an end, an outcome, and until the crime was solved, we just didn't know," Chuck Casper, age 71, said in an exclusive interview with the Idaho Statesman. "Everybody wants to know the end of a story, even sad ones." And finally, CBS 2. Roberta Casper Watson says it's a good feeling to finally get that closure, to finally know for sure what's happened and to be 100% sure. It's like when you read a book, you want to know how it ends. It's been an important aspect of our life, and I find great relief in knowing, Casper Watson said. Identifinders also issued a press release when the case closure was announced. Quote, "We realized immediately that the case would be challenging because Hispanics are not well represented in the genetic genealogy databases," stated Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, president of Identifinders International. "But our persistence paid off. Lisa Lewis did a great job helping Boise police identify Mr. Rodriguez." Lisa told KTVB that, quote, "When I'm working on this, I feel very driven, almost like Joyce was here with me the whole time. There's no closure, there's never closure, but just one step closer to peace. And I felt honored to be able to help her with that." As I mentioned earlier, Lisa Lewis told me that she couldn't really articulate what it was that made her so committed to following the trail of Hilda and Ramona, the two daughters of Ramon Echevarria. She really felt that it was Joyce urging her in the right direction. And it turned out Joyce was right. All right, so who was Frank Rodriguez and what do we know about him? Frank Alonzo Rodriguez was born on May 19, 1970, to R.A. Rodriguez Sr. and a woman named Juanita. As we heard, his parents were not married, but he had a full biological sister from R.A. and Juanita named Myra. I'm going to read Frank's obituary in its entirety. Frank Alonzo Rodriguez, May 19, 1970 to June 28, 2007. We lost him too young. Frank was born in Hartford, Connecticut, and attended grade school in Connecticut prior to moving to Massachusetts, where he attended high school. He then moved to Idaho, where he remained for the remainder of his life. A beloved father, husband, son, and brother, is now sleeping in Jesus. Frank was a self-educated avid reader. He was a painter by trade whose hobbies included reading, basketball, music, and attending concerts with his sons, who he loved more than anything. He is survived by his wife, his sons, and his parents Gary and Juanita, his father R.A. Rodriguez Sr., his siblings Juan Vargas and Myra Casebolt, and other siblings Junior Rodriguez, Nancy Amin, Richard Rodriguez, Jason Rodriguez, and Ryan Rodriguez. Frank had the greatest soul that felt the sorrows and pleasure of all those that he loved. His boys were his world. It was not uncommon to find Frank in the middle of a mosh pit just to be with his boys. He will forever be missed, and we pray that he has found what he has longed for all his life, peace. We will meet again. That all from his obituary. Okay, so as you just heard, Frank was born on the East Coast and relocated with his mom and sister to Idaho. Detective Jagosh spoke with Frank's mother, Juanita, over the phone on May 4th, 2023. She told him much of the information from the obituary. Frank was born in Hartford, Connecticut. Apparently, he spent some time living with an aunt in Puerto Rico. When he was 7 or 8, they moved to Taunton, Massachusetts, where Juanita went to school. They lived there until Frank was about 15. Juanita moved to Michigan for a few months with her 3 children and then moved to Hagerstown, Maryland in 1983. She then moved to Boise in 1985 with the children. 2 of the children, including Frank, went to live with their father in Massachusetts but came back to Boise about 6 months later, and Frank moved in with his older sister Myra and babysat for her while she attended Boise State. The police were unable to find any school records of Frank in Idaho, and Juanita told them that she couldn't remember if he went to school in Idaho at all because he didn't want to go to school. She urged him to learn a trade at Job Corps in Portland, and he did go there for 8 months where he worked as a painter, she recalled. Then he returned to Boise and married his wife, Linda. Juanita left Boise in 1999, moving to Louisiana and then Florida. Frank never went to visit her in either of those states. It doesn't seem that Frank had a very close or loving relationship with his mother. Detective Jagosh asked Juanita whether she had ever observed any troubling behavior in her son Frank. She said he was quiet, but he did have a bad temper. She denied Frank having any mental health issues, although there was one time when he was required to attend counseling after he got into a fight. Alcohol and drugs were his problems, she said. She knew nothing about him hurting anyone, much less murdering anyone. Detective Jagosh learned a lot more about Frank from his wife, Linda. After he collected the DNA of the son who lived with her, they went outside and he told her he was looking at family tree and DNA data related to an Idaho crime from the 1980s. Linda asked whether he thought Frank had done something. Detective Jagosh asked her why she would ask that. Linda said that Frank had a lot of mental health problems. Linda and Frank had met at a club in Boise sometime in 1987 or 1988, but they didn't start dating until 1989. Frank was living with his sister Myra at the time after he dropped out of high school and found work as a painter. Starting in 1987, Frank relocated to Portland, Oregon to work at Job Corps as a painter. He was there for about 8 months. Then he returned to Boise and kindled a relationship with Linda. Their son was born in 1990, and they married in Idaho in 1992. After they married, Linda said it only took her about a month to realize that Frank was not right in the head, as she put it. He would sleep under the bed. He was paranoid and had an explosive temper. Detective Jagosh asked Linda if Frank ever choked her. She said he had done so several times, including once in front of her mother and the baby while they were in the car. As for sexual assaults, Linda said, quote, "Whenever Frank wanted it, he was going to get it. She has PTSD from what happened to her," end quote. Linda said that she stayed with Frank because they had children together. According to Linda, Frank had an explosive temper and would just attack out of nowhere when he got mad. He also abused their sons. He used marijuana and meth and, quote, was not supposed to be left alone with his kids. At one time, his father, R.A. Rodriguez Sr., had paid for a mental health study for Frank that indicated serious emotional problems. Linda said that at one of his jobs, Frank hit a guy on the head with a hammer and was sentenced to probation. Detective Jagosh confirmed Frank's criminal history included one conviction for aggravated assault in Canyon County in 1995. Linda also said that Frank told her once that when he was 12, he got mad at a girl and hit her on the head with a 2x4 with a nail in it that killed her. This is when he lived in Taunton, Massachusetts. The girl had been picking on him at school, so after school he attacked her. Linda also claimed that there were many occasions when Frank didn't come home, and he told her it was none of her business where he was or what he was doing. When he got stressed out, he would just take off, and she didn't know where he went. Detectives did a lot of work to try to connect Frank Rodriguez to other crimes. Detective Jagosh reached out to the Taunton, Massachusetts Police Department, seeking any information on Linda's story that Frank had confessed to killing a girl with a stick. The report could not be confirmed. No crime of that description was on record in that jurisdiction. Detective Jagosh expanded his search to places where Frank was known to have lived. He contacted detectives in Portland, Oregon, South Lancaster, Massachusetts, Hagerstown, Maryland, and both Canyon County and Caldwell, Idaho. Quote, "They were unable to locate any unsolved crimes that matched this or the case of him hitting a child in the head with a stick. They did not find any criminal records or school records on Frank," end quote, other than the assault with the hammer. The Portland police were also unable to find any Job Corps records for Frank from the 1987 to 1988 time period when his family claimed he was there. Detective Jagosh's final report says, quote, "I have found no other similar crimes in the jurisdictions where Frank Rodriguez lived," end quote. But the detective and I talked about Frank and what we know about his horrific slaying of Joyce. He said to me, quote, "You just don't do this crime once and then stop." The detective encourages all other agencies in areas where the family reports Frank was to check all untested evidence for DNA. One similar case was located in Clackamas County from 1988, in which an elderly woman had been strangled and eviscerated. However, the 1988 Clackamas Sheriff's Office report did not mention any sexual assault, and all evidence from the case has long since been destroyed, so we will never know if Frank was involved. Back to the interview with Linda. With Joyce Casper in mind, Detective Jagosh asked Linda if Frank had an attraction for older women. She was quiet for a few minutes and then admitted that she thought Frank had a fetish for her mother. Linda then told the detective a story that is incredibly disturbing. She worked at a Hallmark shop in the Karcher Mall in Caldwell from 1998 to 2001. How was that for an irony that both Joyce Casper and her killer's wife had connections to Hallmark stores? Anyway, Linda came home from work one time and found her mother on the bed naked under a sheet with Frank rubbing her. They both laughed when she came in, she said. Okay, so Frank might have had a thing for older women. Was it possible that for some reason Frank had fixated on Joyce Casper? Well, there's no known connection between Frank Rodriguez and Joyce Casper. At the time of Joyce's murder, Frank was 17 years and 5 months old and lived about 2 miles from the crime scene. He and his sister Myra had lived 2 miles away from Vista Village in the other direction until shortly prior to the crime. So it was possible that Vista Village was a common meeting place for young Frank to meet up with his friends from his old neighborhood. He likely passed the Hallmark store regularly. However, both his apartment complexes were too far outside the canvas perimeter around Vista Village for Frank to have been flushed out by the 1987 police. Linda confirmed that Frank wore his hair long and slicked back. Yes, the detectives I spoke with believe that Frank was the same teen who had already tried once and failed to rob Joyce. The first time, she slapped him a sharp and stinging rebuff. The second time, he vented his rage and frustration on her. Police believe that the fatal attack on Joyce was one of retaliation driven by psychosexual rage. I want to explain here why the methods used by police to track Joyce's killer through high school yearbooks in Boise failed. Frank didn't attend high school once the family moved to Idaho. It's as simple as that. And lack of school records made it that much harder for investigators to find him, including Dr. Fitzpatrick, when she was looking for names of Puerto Rican families in Boise. Frank's mom had married a Caucasian man and taken his last name. Frank didn't go to school and eventually moved to Caldwell, so there was almost no way to put him in Boise in 1987. So I know you're all wondering what Frank Rodriguez's cause of death was. On June 28, 2007, Caldwell, Idaho police received a call to 911 at 3:14 in the morning. A caller reported that a man was leaning up against a fence and bleeding from the mouth. The caller, someone who was driving by, was too afraid to approach the man, so they were unable to tell if the man was breathing. Officer Eduardo Ibarra responded to the scene. The man the caller had reported was leaned in a seated position against a fence, slumped over, legs crossed. He was bleeding from the mouth and nose. A revolver lay in his lap. A closer look revealed a bullet hole gaping in his right temple. He had no pulse. Arriving medics confirmed that the man, identified as Frank Rodriguez, was dead. He was 37 years old. The medical examiner ruled that Rodriguez had died by suicide from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. His wife, Linda, had told Detective Jagosh that at the time he took his own life, Frank suffered from extreme mental illness and was unable to work. I have to say here that Frank's family is horrified to learn of the crime he is now known to have committed. According to what I've seen, they have a lot of empathy for the family of Joyce Casper. It's always interesting how many family members are tragic, first-hand witnesses to violence, abuse, and instability among these unknown suspects, yet they fail to recognize that the victims often extend well beyond the suspect's inner circle. So that is the heartbreaking story of Joyce Casper and the incredibly complex investigation to find the man who brutally snuffed out her life in the back of her car for his own gratification. I think it's safe to say that without forensic genealogy, we would never know who killed Joyce. Frank Rodriguez's name never came up in the investigation. It seems he never told a soul what he'd done. I will say that I was very intrigued by the mention in his death report of a small blue notebook that was recovered from the ground next to Frank's right hand. I asked about it and was told that by the time the Boise investigators learned Frank's name, he'd been dead for more than 15 years. That notebook is long gone. I really want to know if it contained a confession. According to his wife, Linda, Frank left her a note saying it has to be this way or something along those lines. But it doesn't seem that she was ever given the notebook and it was long ago destroyed. Also, I'd like to point out that the traditional methods of identifying suspects, fingerprints, led police astray in this case. Both the prints on the soda can and the rearview mirror led to men who were not suspects. Forensic genealogy is much more efficient and targeted. That being said, in the end it was detective work, a witness interview that led to Frank's name in this case. There was no way for the genealogist to connect Frank to R.A. Rodriguez Sr. and thus to Hilda and Francisco, because there was not a paper trail to follow. As for whether Frank hurt anyone else, I'm not sure what I think. Law enforcement is convinced that he struck again, sometime, somewhere. To me, Frank's murder of Joyce was so sloppy, so rushed, so poorly executed that I think he was very lucky to have gotten away with it for as long as he did. I find it hard to believe he did the same thing again and got away with it again. I wish I knew whether Joyce weighed on his own mind when he took his own life. We will never know. After 36 years, Joyce Casper's case is closed thanks to forensic genealogy. And if you're one of the bad guys, they are coming for you. Thank you so much to Detectives Ransom, Vucinich, Anderson, and Jagosh for speaking with me about this case, and to Lisa Lewis for being very patient in explaining the complicated genealogy analysis. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to DNAIDpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.